I would like to introduce Bilahari Kausikan. He may be familiar to many of you, especially those of you who report in Singapore. He is the former permanent secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. He has been called the undiplomatic diplomat in the best way, meaning he will actually give you his opinion and tell you what he thinks. So please continue with the great questions. He served in the ministry for 37 years and was had appointments both here in Singapore as well as abroad, including being the ambassador to the Russian Federation. So he is, as I said at the beginning of the last session, China is something that has been front and center throughout all of the sessions, really, that we've had. Popping up in a different way have been other issues, so not just questions about China and Taiwan, but Russia and Ukraine, Gaza and Israel and the US and India. These are things that have all come up in different ways. And so he is going to start out by talking a bit about sort of these global conflicts and how they may play into trade, especially in this region, but then we'll be opening it up to questions from you all. So please join me in welcoming back Bilahari.
Thank you for inviting me again. I think this is the third time, which seems to be a little bit reckless on your part, but never mind. But I'm glad to be here. Now, I am going to make a few opening remarks, but I would like this to be a dialogue rather than a monologue. So I'll make these opening remarks as brief as possible. First, some very general observations, which I think need to be made because they're often ignored, although they're quite obvious. Whether you are a person working in a foreign ministry or a journalist, I think we all generally pay far too much attention to events, as we must, and not enough attention to the processes in which events are necessarily embedded. And therefore, sometimes we lose perspective. Right? I think unless you've been living on the far side of the moon, and even then, because the Chinese just sent back one of their space probes from the far side of the moon, it would not have escaped your notice that we are living in turbulent times, right? There's a conflict, there's a war in Ukraine, there's a war going on in Gaza, there is strategic competition between the US and China as a new structural condition of international relations, and so on and so on. But I think to put this in perspective, we have to understand that competition, and therefore at least the possibility of conflict, these are inherent characteristics of international relations. There is nothing unusual about the times we live in. And it's a fundamental mistake to think that any international order is necessarily uncontested. In fact, for most of history, and certainly for 40 years or so after the end of the Second World War, it was the contest that defined the international order, the contest between the US and the Soviet Union. It was only a very short, historically exceptional period, abnormal even, you may call it, of about 20 years or so after the end of the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall came down, when the US was so overwhelmingly dominant that this fundamental reality that competition and conflict are inherent characteristics of international relations was for a short period masked by that power. And even then, there were wars. The US invaded Iraq, and Afghanistan, there were wars. And there were numerous wars in Africa, which nobody bothered to mention. There were at least small, low-level intensity conflicts between Israel and Hezbollah, and between Israel and Hamas. The current war is the fifth, I think, if I counted correctly. Right? And it's a fundamental mistake to mistake that exceptional period for the norm. What we are experiencing now is the norm. That was the exception. However, there's a lot of hankering over that exceptional period and wishful thinking that that should be the norm. Now, I think for most people in this room, or for most of us, the countries we come from, the exceptional period was very beneficial to us. And by the way, that also was beneficial to China. But just because it was good for us doesn't mean make it any less exceptional. And certainly it doesn't make it replicable. So I think we have to start with that firmly in our minds, right? I was asked to talk about Asia's role in the world, in world conflicts and the world economy. And I'll try to do so briefly indirectly. I'm sure all of you, at some point, at least I have, used the trope of an Asian century. An Asian century replacing what was allegedly an American century. But I repeat the point I just made, the American century was never uncontested. And the Asian century, I don't believe that there is going to be an Asian century, except in the most trite term. And in fact, I'm in good company in not believing there will be an Asian century. And I can cite as an authority nobody less than Deng Xiaoping. In 1988, Deng Xiaoping met Rajiv Gandhi, who was then Prime Minister of India, and told him that people are talking about an Asia-Pacific century as if it's going to be it's going to happen automatically. And he said, I don't believe it. Right? And I don't believe it because it means that all the countries have to grow simultaneously. And to add to that, I think Asia, except in a purely geographic sense, which is the most trite sense, is just too incoherent a concept to define a century by it. Some of the most important potential conflicts, anyway, are in Asia. India, China. China, Japan. China, US strategic competition. US is an Asian power because it's a Pacific power, at least. Right? And so on. There are various degrees of conflicts. So I don't believe in this idea of an Asian century, except in the sense that certainly we are living in a world that is no longer dominated completely by the US. And among the countries that are playing a bigger role are several Asian countries. India, Japan, middle powers, Korea, North and South, and so on. You know all these things. My second point, and I'm skipping from point to point just to give you a framework. I mentioned a moment ago that US-China competition is a new structural reality of international relations, which will be with us for a very long time. Time measured in decades, not just a few years. There will be periods of high-intensity competition, periods of low-intensity competition. But it's going to be with us. Being with us, I think we need to understand both the US and China in perspective. One of the most important things that has happened in the last 10 years across the world, including in Southeast Asia, sometimes not talked about, is that I think we have a much more balanced view of China and the US now. It used to be that, almost that China could do no wrong and the US could do no right. Now I think there's a more balance. I mean, China has serious structural problems. I heard the last end of your last presentation. And, when you talk about China, you can always say, is the glass half empty or half full, right? But whether it's half empty or half full, it's still a big glass, right? I don't believe in this idea of peak China, because what does it mean? Peak, the metaphor implies something that is of finite quality. Then you can reach a peak and then it runs down. But growth, in principle, is endless. It can be fast growth, it can be slow growth. But growth doesn't stop unless, the whole place collapses, which is not going to happen in the case of China. And even a China at slow growth, like last year, 5-point-something%, that's about the size of an Australia being added to the Chinese economy and the world economy. So yeah, China has very serious structural problems. Debt, I just heard the last part of the thing. He's talking about household debt, but that's not the debt problem. The debt problem is local government debt. The local governments just account for about, that's a very serious fiscal imbalance. The local governments account for something like 55% or so, or a bit more maybe, of revenue. But they account for more than 80% of the expenditure. And this is simply not sustainable. There are other structural problems, and the longer term one is, of course, demographics, which you all know about. And all of them, to me, stem from a very fundamental fact about China that is not sufficient. It's so obvious that we tend to become invisible. China is a communist country, not in its ideology anymore. You'll probably find more believers in class struggle in American universities or European universities than in China, but certainly in its political structure. It is a Leninist system led by a vanguard party that claims a monopoly of power. And the most important value of the vanguard party is to maintain control. That trumps everything else. And I think one of the problems we had for many years is that we forgot that the purpose of reform in a Leninist system is to entrench the control of the Leninist party. And that, to some degree, limits what it's prepared to do. Some years ago, quite a long time ago actually now that I think of it, 2012, the 18th Party Congress, the party itself admitted that its model that, gave it spectacular growth in the 1990s, in the early part of the 2000s, were not sustainable. And they rolled out a new model that promised, to cut a long story short, more economic efficiency, a decisive role for the market in allocating resources. Very little of that has been implemented. In fact, under Xi Jinping, the trend has been the other way, much more control. Now, control and economic efficiency, these are diametrically opposite values because more efficiency, more market efficiency means less control. It's not an absolute choice. It's a question of finding a new balance, but the balance has tilted, at least in the last 10 years, in the direction of control. And there are good reasons for it. I'm not saying this is illogical, if we think something is illogical, it's usually because we have failed to grasp the first premise. And the first premise of China is to maintain party control. And whatever Xi Jinping is, I think, frankly, he's very mediocre at governance because his values are different. But he's a genius at amassing power. What? What?
I said quite a brave man, but
Why? He is mediocre. I've said it in public, actually. Look at what can you tell me of any initiative he took in the last 10 years that is an unqualified success? Nothing has been a failure. That's true. That's why I don't say he's a failure. I just say he's mediocre. But nothing is an unqualified success, including his signature Belt and Road thing, right? Which they don't boast about so much anymore. Right? Right? What? Tell me one thing that's unqualified success. Don't say the eradication or extreme poverty, because that's not his work. That's the work of many leaders. But it just happened under his watch. Right? What has he done that is unqualified success? Nothing has been bad. Nothing is a total failure, but nothing is unqualified success. And he's mediocre at governance because his idea of governance is more party control. He is an apparatchik to the marrow of his bones. His solution to everything is more control. But anyway, that doesn't mean that China, as I said, you can talk about the glass half empty, half full, but it's a big glass. And it will remain a big glass despite its structural problems for quite some time. Right? On the other hand, the US is a mess. The US politics is a mess. I mean, you got to be really blind and on the far side of Mars not to see that. On the other hand, many years ago, I won't tell you how many years ago because I'll reveal my age. I was a graduate student in the US for 4 years. And the most important thing I learned about the US is that the most important things about the US do not necessarily happen in Washington, D.C. I'm not saying Washington, D.C. is not important. Of course it's important, but it's not the most important things about the US. Because the US was founded by people who basically distrusted strong government and therefore weakened the government deliberately. Now, we can argue that it's probably much more weak and disorganized than absolutely necessary. But, the US government is dysfunctional by design. It's politely called checks and balances. All right? Okay. All right. The most important things about the US, there are two things I took away from 4 years of graduate study in the US. One is a taste for bourbon. And the other is this insight that the most important things of the US do not happen in Washington, D.C. They happen in civic organizations, in big corporations, on Wall Street, in research laboratories, in universities, on main streets of the 50 states. Washington, D.C., of course, has influence, but often the most important things happen despite Washington, D.C., not because of Washington, D.C. And that's been true in different levels of intensity throughout U.S. history. I am old enough to know, to wonder at least, yes, Washington, D.C. is polarized, the politics is dysfunction, is polarized, but I am old enough to wonder, but this is not the worst I've seen of the U.S. I think the 70s, the latter part of which I lived in the US, in the 60s, were much worse. The political turmoil, which resulted in several assassinations. We haven't quite come so far yet, touch wood, okay, touch wood, that it won't come to that in this time. But I don't think the polarization and all that is as bad as it was then. Yeah, you have these demonstrations about Gaza and the universities, but the demonstrations over the Vietnam War were far worse. Why? Because Americans were dying. It's one thing to be concerned about Palestinians dying. It's another thing to be concerned because you may die. So that's another issue. So I think we have to see both the US and China in perspective. They are both normal countries, big countries, important countries, but normal countries with their own strengths and their own weaknesses, right? We also should understand US-China competition correctly. One of the things, and I've said it to previous groups here, that irritates me no end, is this trope of US-China competition being a new Cold War. There are superficial similarities, but I think they're only superficial. And that trope, that historically inaccurate metaphor, misrepresents what is fundamental about their competition. The US and the Soviet Union led two separate systems, and their competition was an existential one to see which was the better way of organizing modern industrial society, right? We know the answer to that now. And all economies now are actually mixed economies. They differ only in the different balance between the market and the planned elements. Planning, by the way, is not confined to China or Vietnam or the socialist economies, the 5 remaining Leninist economies. In the West, planning is called regulation, right? But it's planning. So it's only the mixture. So we all mix economies. And that makes a big difference. It's not a competition between two types of systems. It is competition within a single system. And that system is defined by a historically new phenomenon that grew up during that short, exceptional period I talked about a moment ago. And these are supply chains of a complexity, of a density, and of a scope never before seen in world history. This is what distinguishes 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence. There's never been something like that. I think we still don't know quite how complex this supply chain is. In fact, I always also I think the metaphor of a chain oversimplifies it, because a chain is essentially a very simple linear structure. I think a better metaphor is to think of a tree. You have a complex root system with a trunk leading to branches, leading to twigs, leading to capillaries of leaves, right? And there's a whole forest of these trees. And I find it very difficult to think of this very complex global system within which the US and China compete, bifurcating completely across all domains. There will be partial bifurcation, already has occurred, right? But even that is partial. I don't think, for example, you can completely bifurcate even in high technology areas. Because for a simple reason, China is, say, just take semiconductors. Semiconductors, the last time I checked with somebody, is about 40% of the world semiconductor market. How the hell are you going to cut off 40% of your own companies from 40% of any market, even the market for gummy bears, without doing them irrevocable damage? So you can't, you know, In short, it's a complex competition. And it's also not an existential competition. They are trying to gain advantage over each other. They may want to dominate the system or retain the dominance in the case of the US, but that's a very different thing from one system wanting to replace the other. Right? And I don't think this complexity is going to be erased by wrapping it up in simplistic binaries like, the competition between authoritarianism and democracy. That's nonsense, because there are many types of democracies and there are many types of authoritarianism. And at least in Asia, I don't think we consider every aspect of the Western variant of democracy with unqualified admiration, nor do we recoil with horror from every aspect of every variant of authoritarianism. Right? So it's a stupid way of framing the thing, because I tell my American friends, this is not going to win you any support except among the already converted. In fact, it's going to make people more wary. Right? Okay, so this competition within a system, the dynamics are different. They are complex, not binary, and it's not existential. Let me say that this competition, because it is a structural condition of reality, is going to go on for the indefinite future. Sometimes high intensity, sometimes low intensity. There's always going to be a risk that competition becomes conflict. But frankly, maybe counterintuitively, I don't think the risk is inordinately high for a couple of reasons. One, of course, if you look at whatever you may think of the Chinese leadership, they are not gamblers. And they are not going to roll the dice with the most important thing to them, which is the continuation of party rule. Right? And if they go to war, that's rolling the dice in a big time way. I'll come back to that. If there is a risk, it's going to be conflict by accident, by miscalculation, not war by design. By war by design, I mean war being used as an instrument of policy, such as what Mr. Putin is trying to do in Ukraine, right? And mucking it up. Not as badly as before, but still, we'll come back to that if you want to talk about that later. So the risk is accidents getting out of hand. And I think the other factor that makes this the main risk, not war by design, is something that we don't talk about much in Asia, yet it is the most profound development in international relations in the last almost, 1945 to now, almost 80 years. And that's the nuclear dimension. Nuclear deterrence kept the peace between the US and the Soviet Union. There were a lot of proxy conflicts, but they never went to war. Right? And I think it will keep the peace between the US and China. There may be some people around who are foolish enough to become proxies, but if you can avoid that, why? There's only been one case of direct conflict between two nuclear weapon states. Do you all remember what it is? 1999, Kargil, between Pakistan and India. And even then, although the Pakistanis took a thrashing, they never escalated because it's just too dangerous. Right? And Indians were wise enough to let them have a kind of face-saving way out. Now, so I think this competition can be managed. There are many, in fact, I would say even most international issues have no solutions. That's good news for diplomats and journalists, because it means we'll never be out of a job. Right? Unless, the whole journalistic profession changes, which it is, as you all know better than me. But it can be managed. Sometimes you manage it better, sometimes you manage it worse. Right? Let me talk about two issues that there is no solution to me, but can be managed. And this is Taiwan and Gaza. All right? Taiwan, frankly, I see there is the prospect of a voluntary reunification is nil. Right? Why would the Taiwanese want to voluntarily reunify? There is no support in Taiwan, and many opinion polls. Any Taiwanese here? I just came back from Taiwan. I'm going next week again. Right? I mean, there are many, you know this better than me. There's no support for the two extremes of unilateral independence or reunification. Most people want the status quo to remain. And I think the status quo can be maintained. There are only two scenarios where I think that the Chinese must fight. They are not keen, by the way. They never renounce the use of force. But I don't think that's their preferred option because, as I said, it's just too big a gamble. And if they fail, Mr. Putin can fail to achieve his goals in Ukraine. He's still sitting in the Kremlin. There is no Chinese leader that can do something against Taiwan and fail and remain in power. And even the roots of party rule will be shaken, right? So they are not gamblers. And there are other things they can do short of launching a war. But I think there are two scenarios where they must fight because no Chinese leader can, under those two scenarios, not fight and retain his power. The first is a very low probability, high impact scenario, which is if Taiwan revives its nuclear weapon ambitions. It had such ambitions in the 1970s and was pursuing them quite well, I would think, with the help of Israel and South Africa, until the Americans found out and slapped all three of you down and said, stop this nonsense. But the world has changed. I think it is almost inevitable that South Korea and Japan will become nuclear weapon states, probably within my lifetime, despite my advanced years. Provided I don't get run over by a bus after leaving you all. Okay. Certainly within your lifetime, since you're all much younger. Right? And when that happens, there will be a lot of pressure in Taiwan. I think the pressures can be resisted. But that's a very low probability but high impact scenario. If Taiwan revives its nuclear weapon ambitions in any credible way, China must fight. Because if Taiwan becomes even a threshold state, this idea of reunification, even as a distant dream, is over. And that strikes at the heart of the narrative by which the Communist Party legitimates its right to its monopoly of power. And they cannot tolerate that. But it's a low probability scenario. Not zero, but low. The higher probability scenario is if Taiwanese domestic politics takes some strange turn. Right? I said there is no support. I don't think the risk is some Taiwanese politician will one day get up and think it's a jolly good idea to declare independence. Because there's no support. There's no political gain to be derived from doing so. But there are red lines. Right now, there is, and you Taiwanese know this better than me, there is a Taiwanese Chinese identity which is different from the mainland Chinese identity. So that really hollows out the idea of one China, except as a slogan. It hollows out the 1992 consensus, except as a slogan. And that actually is what the KMT and the DPP and any third party will have in common. And because you have it in common, you have to defend Taiwanese sovereignty in one way or the other. And then that may cross red lines, short of unilateral independence. And it's a tricky situation because I don't think even Beijing knows what those red lines are until they are crossed. Right? And what constitutes a red line today may not be tomorrow, and what is not a red line today may become one next week or next month. And that's tricky. And the trickiness is, I've been observing Taiwan and going there since the first time I set foot in Taiwan is 1976. And I've been going there quite regularly. There was a hiatus where I didn't go, and I just came back, and I'm going next week again. I think there are two things I observed over this long period of time that are disturbing in the context of Taiwanese domestic politics. First of all, there has been a diminution in the Taiwanese will to defend itself. Ukraine gave it a shock, but I don't think a big enough shock to completely reverse this trend. Some of you remember, I can't remember, it's during Ma Ying-chou's time when there was a training accident and a conscript died. And two defense ministers had to resign. And you reduce the period of conscription to 4 months. Now, 4 months is a joke. In 4 months, you can teach a soldier, provided he's reasonably intelligent, not to shoot himself in the foot and not to shoot his comrade, okay? Now you have increased it, I think, to a year, which is not better than 4 months, but not enough. Right? And more to the point, if you ask any American defense contractor, you are not buying enough of the right kind of weapons. Right? Why? Because what you need are sea drones, you need sea mines, you need anti-ship missiles. These don't make for good parades. Abraham tanks make for good parades. And I asked somebody, why you want Abraham tanks? Because if the Chinese land is over, the point is to stop them far away, not let them land. And tanks are useless for that. You need some. You need aircraft, which you are going to get, I guess. But I think that will to defend yourself, I am very skeptical, frankly, among the elite. The Abeng Alliance, they got no choice. They have to fight. Right? But the elite are frankly very skeptical. And that is irrespective of their political affiliation. Right? Secondly, I see, as this will to defend itself declines, I see a rise in the sense of entitlement. I am the only Chinese democracy, so of course somebody has got to help me. And nowadays, I am the only Chinese democracy and I have chips. So of course somebody must help me. Now these two trends are in the context of Taiwanese domestic, I think can lead to some disturbing scenarios. I think the day is not upon us yet, but it can lead there. Let me end with a few words on Gaza. Gaza is the international problem par excellence, which there is no solution. It can only be managed. It's been ill managed for quite a long time. It could be better managed. And there's a lot of hypocrisy around it. This is all not for publication, but I'll tell you this. None of the Arab governments give a damn about the Palestinian issue. Right? Ever since they fought 3 wars against Israel, lost all of them. Egypt and Jordan normalized relationship. And after 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the main geopolitical issue has been Iran, particularly for the Gulf monarchies. Because don't forget, it's not just a Sunni Shia thing. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and probably to the Gulf monarchies, that is a bigger threat than the Sunni Shia thing. It's a republic. And the kind of revolution they are trying to ferment is a Republican revolution. And since then, that has been the main focus. There's a lot of lip service in the UN and elsewhere about the Palestinian cause. But where has the Arab governments poured the most money in ever since 1973? Which cause? It is the Iraq-Iran war. Because that was really existential to them. And after the Arab Spring, there was a further issue. They knew that they had to reform their own systems. And of what use is the Palestinians to that cause? Who can help? And that's the underlying basis of what we call the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, to put it in stark terms, is an American-sponsored anti-Iranian alliance. And that is why, despite all the wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth and rendering of clothes over Gaza and the civilian casualties, not a single member of the Abraham Accords has left it. And Saudi Arabia will eventually join. Not imminently, it's not going to happen in the next few years because of Gaza, but they have been cooperating with Israel quite very well. Because that is the real issue. Therefore, there is no solution. I will go even further. I go to Israel quite often, and every 2-3 trips I go to the West Bank. I'm not so suicidal to want to go to Gaza, but I go to the West Bank very regularly. And I came to the very sad conclusion that none of the principal players on the ground, which are the Israeli right, and there's no more Israeli center, by the way, these days, after 7 October. No more Israeli left, definitely, and a very, very weak center. And the center has shifted rightwards too. Not the Israeli right, not Fatah or the Palestinian Authority, and certainly not Hamas. They don't want a solution. They talk about a solution. Why? Because a solution will be a disaster for all of them. Another Nakba. Why? Because what keeps them in power is some level of conflict. I have a very good friend. When the last time I went to West Bank, which just before COVID, he had just resigned from the Palestinian Authority. He was a minister. And I asked him why he resigned. He told me, well, we failed in the struggle, we failed in governance. So I don't want anything more to do with this. Right? And and that's the sad thing. No, look, just think. That is the land of miracles. So maybe a miracle will happen. There will be a two-state solution, right? But what does a two-state solution mean for whoever, say, the Palestinian Authority? What it means that overnight, it will cease to be an international cause célèbre, attracting all kinds of aid, mainly from silly Europeans, and become just another ill-governed, corrupt third world state, which means aid will dry up because it has no strategic importance as a state. Its strategic importance now, insofar as it has much diminished, is because there is a conflict at some level. That's the hard fact. So I'm not saying this is the ideal state of affairs. We all talk about a two-state solution, and I think most people would at least formally say that we are in support of most countries of a two-state solution. But I have not seen anybody come up with a viable pathway to a two-state solution. And right now, because of 7 October and the consequent war, there is a very fundamental contradiction. Any kind of two-state solution must rest on a foundation of stability. And that foundation of stability must rest on Israel's ability to deter its enemies, both state and non-state. I think they have done a pretty good job in deterring the state, the former enemies, their states, right? But they are doing a lousy job of deterring the non-state actors, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or there are innumerable smaller groups, right? But what they need to do, and they are doing now with gay abandon in Gaza to restore deterrence, is going to make any pathway to a two-state solution even more difficult. And there are at least substantial numbers of Israelis and Palestinians that do not want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. So it can be better managed, but there is no solution. That's not, we all, to the Arab countries, to most Southeast Asian countries, to most countries in the world, the Palestinian issue is actually a domestic political problem to be managed. Right? And that's the hard reality. Of course, if you write all these things, you will be howled out of your newsrooms. And if I say all these things in public, people will throw stones at me. But that is the harsh fact of life. Right? Okay, I'll stop here and take your questions. Wow, so many. All right.
My name is Uzmi. I'm from India. Just I wanted a clarification that when you say can be better managed, the Gaza situation, what do you mean exactly? I just wanted to understand.
What we have to do, and this also applies to Taiwan, all of us have to, in the case of Taiwan, keep the myth that there will be eventually a reunification alive in a credible way. And in the Palestinian issue, we have to keep the myth that there will be one day two states alive in a credible way. Right? People are doing a better job, a slightly better job in the case of Taiwan than in the case of Gaza. That's what I mean. Because a lot of international relations and diplomacy consists of keeping myths credibly alive so that people did not take drastic actions, which gives you something to write about and gave me, before I retired, employment. Sorry, somebody else had questions.
Yeah, I'm Nitin Cook. I'm a journalist based in Japan. I used to be based in Southeast Asia. When I travel the region, countries like Indonesia, people say like they're benefiting from being, kind of neutral, not taking a side, getting investment from China, the US, Japan. Is that sustainable? Or do you, at some point, those countries in Southeast Asia need to be playing a larger role at the diplomatic stage globally? And what kind of role can Southeast Asian countries play?
None. I tell you what we mean. We often use this term, we don't want to take sides, right? I use it, we use it. In fact, Singapore is one of the most assiduous users of that phrase. But it's not quite well understood what we mean. Actually, we have taken sides. I just use Singapore as an example. We have taken sides. What we mean is we do not need to align our interests across all domains in one direction or another. In the case of Singapore, on defense and security issues, we have taken sides long ago. It's quite clear. you have to be blind, deaf, dumb, and a bit stupid not to see which side we have taken, which is the West, which is the US, for security. On the other hand, on certain political issues, right? For example, is there such a thing as unqualified freedom of speech? We are much more aligned in our interests with China and similar things, right? That's a fact. In the case of economics, we are completely promiscuous. We can play with anybody that is worth our while. And I don't think I think this is a general Southeast Asian attitude with a few exceptions, Laos being one. And Laos, anybody from Laos here? No. Because I tell you why. I don't blame the Laotians, because who the hell else apart from China is going to invest in Laos in any big way, right? So they have no choice. So I'm sympathetic to what they're doing. I think it's a mistake, by the way, because they are surrendering agency to some external power, and that never ends well in Southeast Asia. But in principle, what we mean when we say don't want to choose, that means we would like to choose according to our interests, and our interests may be different in different domains. So we don't have to line up all our ducks neatly in one direction or another. And I think that's perfectly sustainable, because this is no longer a binary competition. This is a complex competition. And in that complexity, there is opportunity to exercise agency. Now, whether you have the brain to recognize the opportunity and the institutions or agility to seize those opportunities, those are different matters. But in principle, there is opportunity. If it's a binary situation, then you have only choice of A or B. In a complex situation, the choices are for you, for your own ingenuity to create, if necessary, right? So I think it's quite sustainable. It's provided we don't panic and we don't lose confidence in our own agency. But to play a role in the US-China relations in Gaza, come on, these are fantasies. Somebody else?
Hi, thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. This lady has been patiently waiting. Both of you, which one? You settle among yourselves. I'm not getting involved in this.
Sorry, I'll go first. Thank you so much. I'm Selfa with Taiwan's Commonwealth Magazine, and thank you so much for pointing out the importance of Taiwan. So I have two questions. The one is, I'm wondering if there are any substantial cooperation, the possibility of substantial cooperation between Taiwan, Japan, and Philippines in terms of military. That's my first question. And the second question would be, what's your takes on the upcoming U.S. election to Taiwan, the impact to Taiwan?
Cooperation between Taiwan, Japan, and Philippines, I think there is some scope, but I wouldn't place too much hope on it. It will happen, but in a kind of low level, not going to be very strategically decisive. The strategically decisive player is the US. That's the only one that really matters. The rest are supporting actors, whether it's Philippines, Korea, Japan, right? Now that brings you to the second part of your question, which is a very important one. And the simple answer is I don't know. Because look, the first Trump administration, there was a struggle among different factions in his administration over Taiwan. He made that phone call. And I know who put up him. I know the guy. And he's been plotting that for ages. And I called him after that and said, this is your doing, right? And he didn't deny it. He just chuckled over the phone, right? But that guy is gone. That guy was working for Pence, actually, and Pence is bad news. And anybody close to him is bad news. Then a few weeks later, when he talked to Xi Jinping, he reaffirmed one China, right? And people saw it as a contradiction. I saw it as a different factions within his administration, and the more mainstream faction reasserting itself. Now, I simply do not know the answer to your question, because I do not know who are going to be, if there is a Trump administration, who is there, right? Who is going to be in there, right? But I think there is going to be a big problem. Biden said 4 times that the US will defend Taiwan. I don't think Trump probably only has a very hazy idea of where Taiwan is. Okay, right? I mean, that's the fact, all right? And I don't think he may say, well, you know, if he will probably sell Taiwan much more weapons because it's money, right? And you pay for them. It's not that anybody's giving them to you, right? But whether he will give you a guarantee in the way that Biden has, at least implicitly, I very much doubt it. Right? So I think there's something for Taiwan to worry about. Yeah.
Okay, this is Mia from South China Morning Post in
From
Hong
where,
Kong.
sorry?
This is Mia from South China Morning Post in
Okay.
Hong Kong. So I
I
have
forgive you anyway.
Yeah, so I have one question. So how do you see the stance of Lebanon and Egypt in terms of the war in Gaza? Like, do you think like politicians from these two nations, they could adopt any like aggressive like policies after seeing all of this war? And do you see like any possibility of a greater like even greater conflicts in this region? And my another question is like, apart from the war in Ukraine, like the Gaza, and also another war in Ukraine, like Russian conflict, if there's a next war, where do you think it's going to happen? Like the most possible answer.
Okay. I think those are good questions. I think Lebanon and Egypt are two different issues. Right? Egypt, if it is possible, despises Hamas and hates it even more than the Israelis. Right? And they have been not particularly nice to the Palestinians. And that applies to Jordan too. Right? So I don't think Egypt is going to get involved in any way. Hezbollah is the forward defense of Iran. Right? The rest of Lebanon doesn't matter. Lebanon is not really a country anymore. In fact, it's different sects of different things. Maronite Christians, Sunni, Shias, and all that. Right? From the very beginning of the Gaza war, this latest Gaza war, I was convinced that it will be a sub-regional conflict and remain a sub-regional conflict. Of course, there's always a risk of it spreading, but again, by accident, not by design. Right? And I still am of that view. There is, of course, the risk of it spreading, but it's by accident, something miscalculated or something. Why did I come to that conclusion? It's because Palestine is simply not important enough for anybody of the major actors to want to have a major war. On the other hand, I am convinced that sooner or later, and this answers the second part of your question, there will be a big war in the Middle East. But that big war is not going to be fought over Palestine. It's going to be fought over Iran's nuclear capability. Because that cannot be tolerated and it cannot be stopped short of war. And that will be a big war. And that's why all the players now are, in a way, conserving their ammunition. Hezbollah does not want to get into a fight now. Neither does Israel. A lot of what has been going on back and forth between Israel and Hezbollah, what I understand, is performance art. Very few people have been killed. A lot of the shooting has been into empty spaces to show support for the Palestinians on the Hezbollah part and to show that they retaliate on the Israeli part. A few people get killed here and there. Now, I'm not saying this is going to remain forever, but I don't think the time for a big war over Iran's nuclear capability is now. So if this thing spreads, it will be by accident. But I don't think that risk is very high. It's not low, but it's not like it's going to happen tomorrow or the after. There have been a lot of speculation, because Netanyahu just said that the Gaza war is going to be in a new phase, right? And I think that's quite logical because the new phase, all the major targets in Gaza have been destroyed, right? So the next phase will be to hunt down individual members of Hezbollah and kill them, all right? And they will do that. But some people speculate that means he's going to shift focus to the northern front. I don't think he wants to do that unless he's forced to. I don't think Hezbollah wants to force him to do that. I don't think Iran wants to do that because they are all conserving their forces for the big war that everybody knows will come. When, I don't know. One of the things, I think it's slightly more probable now, because look, when was it? 2 months ago, Iran shot off some of his best weapons at Israel. They all shot down, right? In fact, the most important weapons, the ballistic missiles, at least half, I was told, failed at launch. I mean, they didn't even get off the ground, right? Now, if I was an Iranian general, that means to me, that's a strong argument to acquire nuclear capability. Because nuclear capability, you don't have to need to use it. You just have to have it. And that's the whole point, right? So I think that risk has gone up a bit. Sorry, you had a question? Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
So
Yeah.
I'm Nghi from
You better be the.
I'm Nghi from Vietnam. So I want to hear your assessment on Biden or Xi Jinping and recently Putin visiting Vietnam, and and it make Vietnam become a rising destination in economy and also geopolitics. And do you think that there will be a sustainable status for us for Vietnam, and at the same time it become difficulties and also advantages for us in the world, in the whole world? And
I think Vietnam, you know what I said about not wanting to choose, meaning is we choose according to our own interests, and our interests may be different in different domains. Vietnam plays this game the best in Southeast Asia. Right? Because you have been playing this game for 2,000 years. Why are you Vietnamese and not Chinese? Right? Because you refuse to become Chinese and play this game for 2,000 years, right? That's why that's why there is a Vietnam. So you are very good at this, right? Okay. So I think it is quite sustainable for you.
No. For another questions, the new canal was, the Cambodia government is announcing they have a new canal project. They call
the canal, that thing, right?
Funan Techo kind of. So, what are your assessment on the political way between the China, Vietnam, and the Cambodia in the canal, with the canal?
Well, you obviously know the answer. Vietnam not very happy, right? Right? But what are you going to do? Is it going to make a huge strategic difference? To Vietnam, yeah, because it means that the Cambodians need not go through Vietnamese ports. But they don't need to go to Vietnamese ports today even, right? There are other alternatives, maybe more expensive and so on. So this will reduce the cost. But this kind of thing, are you going to go to war against Cambodia again? Of course not, right? So you just have to swallow it. But it's not a fatal thing to Vietnam. It does not change does not change your basic strategic situation in any fundamental way. It's an inconvenience. It's an irritation. But I don't think it makes a huge strategic difference. Right? So, okay. But I think also there is a difference between Cambodia and Laos. Laos has very few alternatives. Cambodia, I think, has some alternatives and is hedging a bit better against over-dependence on China. May not, therefore, turn to Vietnam as it did in the past, but it is trying in some ways to improve its relationship with the West. Right? And it's good that Austin went to Cambodia.
So you said earlier that there may be some people who will be hurt if they're stupid enough to become proxies in a US-China conflict, referring to Southeast Asia, I guess, or more generally, but I'm bringing that to Southeast Asia. Clearly, the Philippines is the country now that it is in the most dangerous position of any Southeast Asian country. How do you see the current situation in the Second Thomas Shoal developing, but also is the Philippines able to balance and to maintain its position between the US and China, or does the territorial issues become too much of an irritant that has to be solved somehow?
Well, the South China Sea territorial disputes is another example of problems with no solution that can be managed. And I actually, when I was talking about people foolish enough to become proxies, I was thinking of the Philippines. Right? I think the Philippines has put too much trust in guarantees from the US. Right? Because how many of you have read the 1951 US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty? You read? Then you know it means nothing. The title is extremely misleading. It's nothing to do with mutual defense. At best, it says, if there's a problem, I may help you take it to the UN. Now, what big deal is that, right? Now, there is a political commitment from the Biden administration, I think, right? which was also, to my mind, a little incautious. But political commitments are always situational and conditional. So even if Biden is really elected, he may not see the same commitment, right? So I think it was a little reckless. I can understand why. I am generally not very sympathetic to the Chinese position in the South China Sea, but on this one, I think they have a point. I think there was some kind of implicit deal, understanding that you can resupply, the Philippines can resupply, but not rebuild, right? Right? Without weapons, and you can give them food and and so on, but not rebuild. Weapons, even a couple of rifles, is not going to make any difference one way or the other. But that ship is rusting away. It cannot be there forever. So you need to rebuild it. And that, I think, is... But that all said, I think Philippines, China, and the US have put themselves in a corner. And they got to find some way out. I don't think anybody is keen to go to war, despite what President Marcos Jr. said at the Shangri-La dialogue, which was clearly something he misspoke. He said if one Philippine sailor dies, it's an act of war. That, I think it's a gross exaggeration, right? And I don't think he's keen to go to war. I don't think the Chinese want to go to war, but they cannot tolerate you rebuilding the ship. On the other hand, you cannot let the ship abandon Second Thomas Shoal. And the US has put itself in this corner. So that is a very... I don't know what the solution is, but that is right now the most immediate cause of problems. But I still think they are not going to go to blows over this because it's simply not important enough to the US or to China. They want not let Philippines rebuild the thing and entrench the position, but they don't want to go to war over that. They got enough problems at home. They got enough problems with Taiwan, among other things. They got problems all over the world. You look at the Chinese position, geopolitical position in Asia, it's very bad. Who can they rely on? Who are their partners? North Korea is only formal treaty ally. North Korea and Chinese distrust each other profoundly. In fact, I've heard North Koreans tell me they distrust the Chinese more than the Americans. They told me so. I used to go to North Korea quite regularly when I was a diplomat. And for a very simple reason. America is far away. China is here. Right? And the history of Korea's relations with China, north or south, is not an easy one. Who else? Laos, big deal. Have it, please. Cambodia, I think, is hedging, Who else? Pakistan? Is Pakistan a liability or asset? Central Asian countries are Central Asian countries. They play the game quite well, right? They're never going to abandon Russia, despite what their concerns are. Never going to get completely in bed with China either. So they're quite good. Who else? So China is in a very bad geopolitical situation. What I said about why is she Vietnamese and not Chinese also applies to Koreans and Japanese. Since the 16th century, at least in the case of Japan, a core element of Japanese identity is not being Chinese. So that they are not going to compromise ever. Ditto for Korea. Ditto for Vietnam. Indonesia. India is a big ancient country. It's never going to be subordinate itself to China. And it's a nuclear power, so that, a 62 war is not probable. Indonesia, I've always told my Chinese, any Indonesians here? How come none? Oh, where? Okay. Indonesia, bebas dan aktif, right? I translate this. I just told somebody, a Chinese friend yesterday. You all assume that people take money and they will do what you do. We want them to do. Indonesia has a long and proud history of being bebas and active, meaning I take money from anybody and I do what I want. And it's a big country, You can't make them do anything that they don't want to do. So you cannot capture Japan, you cannot capture Korea, you cannot capture India, you cannot capture Vietnam, you cannot capture Indonesia. You are in a really bad position. You got Solomon Islands, big bloody deal. You got Laos, great. Please have it, So I don't think they are in a good position, which is another reason why I don't think they are keen to start a war. Yeah. Sure. I got time.
Sir,
Hi. Hello.
upon, okay.
Back here, yes.
Where? Oh, you. Okay.
I was actually trying to know your assessment or your idea about Netanyahu's recent plan to share the land of Gaza. In one, making a free trade zone to create trade opportunities from east to west, and another to give a free place for the Hamas or the Palestinians, considering the fact the Arab countries will make a separate authority for them to monitor the entire place. Do you support this kind of peace will actually be in place and this will be
I don't
accepted
think
by
it's-
the other Muslim countries?
I don't think it's a real plan. It's just a plan because when did he announce this? Just tell me the timing. You remember the timing?
Just a few months back.
Because his defense minister is in Washington. That's all. And his defense minister wants more weapons, and he will get them. So he just has to help Biden by saying, "I've got this plan." I don't think this. First of all, I don't think it's practical, right? Secondly, I don't think he means it, and I don't think the Arabs care one way or the other. As long for the Arabs, it is a domestic. Now, Arab government is losing any sleep. Not Egypt, not Jordan, not Saudi Arabia, not UAE. Maybe Qatar a little bit, maybe Oman a little bit, but none of them are losing any sleep over the Palestinians being killed. Their people are, because there's a difference of attitude between the governments and the people. Therefore, it means this is a domestic political issue for them to manage. And that's why the Arabs have their peace plan. Now Netanyahu has one, and many people have one, right? So, but I don't believe it's serious. And I don't believe there's any prospect of it being implemented.
Sir, this is Hasif from Bangladesh. I work for Channel 24. So my first question is why the Singapore trusted in terms of building the capacity in terms of security and defense with the US? Why not the countries close by? And the second
Because the countries close by are the people who are threats.
Right. I mean, and the second question is, do you think the recent upgradation of the relationship between China and Iran is a big concern for the West?
Okay, I'll answer your first question. Right. First of all, let's frankly look, Southeast Asia, ASEAN notwithstanding, we are not a happy band of brothers. Okay, if we are a happy band of brothers, there will be no need for ASEAN, because its fundamental purpose is to manage relations among its members. Right. Secondly, we don't rely on the US to shed blood to defend us. We never thought the US will shed blood to defend us. We are not a treaty ally of the US. We only rely on the US for two things. One, to sell us certain weapons that we need to maintain deterrence. And secondly, to maintain the overall balance in the region, which they have done very consistently for half a century as offshore balancer. Right? That's all we rely on the US. What's the second part of the question? Why not?
Part of the question, the recent upgradation of the China-Iran relationship.
Look, it should be of concern to the West. It is concern to the Arab countries. It's of concern to Israel. To us in Southeast Asia, so what? Look, Iran's concern, the relationship with Iran and actually Russia too, is very similar. I just mentioned that in Asia, China's geopolitical position is not favorable, right? Globally, it is not favorable either. Russia, is it an asset or a liability? Time will tell. But the fact is, China has no other partner that shares its distrust of the West with any strategic weight except Russia. Globally and in the Middle East with Iran. Look, China cannot give the Arab countries or Israel the kind of security guarantees vis-a-vis Iran that they need. They turn to the US. All right? So that answers your question. I think for the West, because Iran supplying drones and stuff to, excuse me. I don't know whether it's a blessing or not, but thank you. All right. But anyway, it should be of concern to the West. But look, I must make one final point, right? After the end of the Cold War, the US does not face any existential threat anywhere in the world. Right? Therefore, the US has become much more transactional or much more discriminating in how it gets involved. This happened in Southeast Asia 50 years ago. The US made a huge mistake in Vietnam, and as part of correcting that mistake, they shifted their posture from direct intervention to being offshore balancer. And they have been very consistent for 50 years as offshore balancer. Something similar is happening in the Middle East. After they made a mistake in Iraq and Afghanistan, they have shifted to offshore balancing. And what they have done during the Gaza war has been quite a successful example of offshore balancing. They sent 2 aircraft carriers and 1 Tomahawk armed nuclear submarine. Right? Immediately, Iran at least twice sent word through back channels, I don't want a wider regional war. They have not been very successful in deterring the Houthis because these Houthis are mad. Right? I came to this conclusion. There has never been a period in Yemen's history where they are not fighting each other or fighting somebody. Right? They love it. That's their natural state of affairs. So how you deter this kind of people? Right? But even then, you know, okay, they have not stopped shooting at ships, and you know, they just sunk some Greek ship that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the last time I checked, which is not recently, to be honest, maybe you know better, huh? We were more recent information. I don't think the insurance and shipping rates have gone up a great deal, you know. Certainly oil price has not gone up a great deal. It's more expensive to go around the long way around, but it's marginally more expensive. And it's got some supply chain disruption, but not very serious ones. So that's why I said this is a small war. And unless accidents or miscalculation happen, it will remain a small war because it's simply not that important. All right. On that,
I think this was a, we're over time.
Okay, all right,
so
then.
You can follow up privately.
Yeah.
I think this was a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation to end the fellowship on. Thank you so much.